Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Hey, everybody. Good to be back. So this is episode 13, and we're recording this on May 30th, 2022.
On this week's show, Biden just completed a historical trip to Asia, which is something we feel like we have to discuss. Since we are unable to record next weekend, we are bringing this to you a week early. As part of Biden's trip, we will be talking about North Korea's latest missile test in light of its rapid COVID-19 outbreak and the Yoon-Biden summit, which renewed and expanded security cooperation between South Korea and the U.S. Most of the trip, however, was about containing China. Biden stated that the U.S. would respond militarily if Taiwan were attacked, while the White House said U.S. policy has not changed. Shifting from security to economics, the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership has paved way for China's dominance of economic leadership in the region. To reclaim U.S. leadership, Biden concluded the trip with an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But what is it, and will anything of substance come from it? We'll also provide a quick update of Colombia's elections, which the first round was just held this weekend. But to begin with, since we did not have much banter for this past week, been pretty quiet.
Yeah, guess so.
We are going to return to doing the news quiz from foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm ready to take that on again. I mean, we haven't had such a great track record, but, let's give it a shot, see if we can do better than our 50% fairly passing marks.
That's probably where we'll be again, but we'll see. Okay, question 1. This week, the White House had to walk back yet another overstatement from U.S. President Joe Biden on Taiwan. Which of Biden's past statements is actually in line with formal U.S. policy? 1, it's independent, it makes its own decisions. 2, we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. 3, the idea it can be taken by force is just not appropriate. And 4, we made a sacred commitment to respond if, in fact, any were to invade or take action against Taiwan.
Yes, I definitely is number 2. So we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage a peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues.
That does sound... Yay, we got one. Okay.
Off to a great start. All right, number 2. The United Nations Human Rights Chief completed a tour of China this week, which some countries criticize as an opportunity for Chinese propaganda amid the state campaign against the Uyghur minority group. What is the top human rights official's name? Antonio Guterres, Filippo Grandi, Audrey Azoulay, or Michelle Bachelet?
I'm going to go with the first one.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that one because that's the only person I think is associated with UN.
I know, right? But it's actually, it's actually Michelle Bachelet.
All right, 1 out of 2.
It's like our usual track record.
Yep.
Question 3. Meanwhile, a UN diplomat from which country resigned on Monday, criticizing his nation's leaders for their pompous, tasteless palaces? Russia, France, United States, or China?
Wow, UN diplomat. Yeah, I missed this in the news, but there's only 2 countries that have pompous, tasteless palaces, and that's France and Russia. So I'm going to say France.
Really? I'm going to say Russia.
Okay.
And it was Russia.
Wow.
I actually did.
You saw that story?
I'm pretty sure I saw that story, in the back of my head.
Good one.
Because
nice.
I was like, I saw the headline. I didn't read the story, but I was kind of like, what is relevant about that?
Actually, I'd take that back. France doesn't have tasteless palaces. They define taste. Come on.
Oh, well, this one we can't miss, huh?
Yeah. So if Gustavo Petro wins this Sunday's election, he'll become the first left-wing president of which Latin American country? Ecuador, Argentina, Colombia, or El Salvador?
obviously Colombia.
Colombia, yeah.
Which would be even sadder because we're actually talking about that.
Yeah, that'd be a little sad we missed this one. Yeah.
Doing pretty good so far.
Yeah, you're nailing it. Doing good.
5. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson faced calls to resign yet again this week after photographs emerged of him doing what? Shoplifting from a Tesco supermarket.
That would be pretty fun.
That would be awesome. I wish that was.
I hope that one's true. I don't think that's true.
Drinking at a Downing Street party, gambling in Las Vegas, kissing a fellow politician.
Man, I missed this one too.
Did you really?
Yeah, I missed this one. I mean, of course, everything has been about his parties and things. I want to say drinking at a Downing Street party.
Yeah, it just came to light all the parties he was having at his house this week.
And that's different from the other parties that...
Yeah, because those were on the government premises and he...
10 Downing Street or something?
I
haven't followed this one closely.
Yes, but yes, that
was
the
drinking?
answer.
Okay. God, I wish it was the shoplifting one. That would be very funny. Okay, number 6. Which country launched a missile test thought to include an intercontinental ballistic missile on Wednesday? Iran, India, North Korea, or Israel?
See, yeah, a pretty good idea covering news topics in the podcast.
I think we think so. So obviously North Korea. Yeah.
Going well. So, which former U.S. Secretary of State said this week that Ukraine should avoid a worse outcome by ceding some territory to Russia? No, this one too. Mike Pompeo, Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, these are normally a lot harder.
I know. Why do we know
I think
all
we're
these?
getting to the hard ones. All right. Number 8, the UN began its International Week of Solidarity with peoples of non-self-governing territories on Wednesday. Which of the following is not a non-self-governing territory according to the world body? Pitcairn, not pronouncing that right, Samoa, Western Sahara, and Guam.
I'm going to... Samoa have its own country? I guess maybe not. Western Sahara then?
Oh, man. Yeah, I guess I'll go with the first one. I have no idea where that's at.
It was Samoa, as I was just reasoning.
Samoa, huh? Okay.
Oh, wait.
But not
Samoa, this is what confuses me. Samoa is an independent country. However, American Samoa is a territory.
Place.
Yeah. I always get these things confused. All right. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu terrible, had a busy day on Friday. Which fellow diplomat did he not meet with on that day? I'm not even going to say this, but I will say the countries. Emirati, the UAE, Romanian foreign minister, Finnish foreign minister, Polish foreign minister.
Wow.
I'm going to say Romanian.
Yeah, because Polish, NATO, this is all about probably the NATO discussions. Finnish makes sense. Emirati wouldn't necessarily. I might go Emirati just to have a second.
Okay, I'm pretty sure I read about a news delegation there.
Too, man. Okay.
Headlines, just headlines.
You're nailing it.
But it was the Finnish foreign minister. Really?
The Finnish, right? The one you would expect to be talking with.
Well, yeah, because I know there were negotiations specifically with Finland regarding
NATO,
possible concessions that they might.
Yeah.
So
we talked about it last week.
Yeah, so that is surprising to me.
All right, last one. Commuters in Nigeria were startled on Tuesday when they saw something unusual heading along a major highway. What was it? A herd of wild horses, an airplane, a 3-story building on wheels, an Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. I'm going to say an airplane. That sounds like Nigeria, and from my brief experience there.
Okay, I'm just going to go with the funniest answer. Well, one of the funniest answers. Yeah, I guess that would be funny, but that's not one. No, actually,
funny.
A 3-story building on wheels.
Okay.
But it was an airplane, so yeah. But I'm just picturing the 3-story building on wheels, and it's very amusing to me. Mm-hmm. Not completely improbable, but amusing. Unlikely.
Yeah. I'm not sure the roads would handle that. I'm not sure the roads handle an airplane either very well, but I can see that more than the 3-story building.
Well, if you want to join with us, unfortunately, foreign policy paywalls, but that is where the quiz comes from. It's called What in the World? So we decided we got both probably 6 right, which is a little over half.
Still failing grade, though, by any measure of grading.
You can't catch every news story. And like I said, a couple of those narrowed down the choices, but not necessarily the correct one.
Yeah.
All right. So some quick updates. This weekend is when the Colombian presidential elections were held. If a candidate does not get above 50%, it goes to a runoff. It was expected to go to a runoff. The left candidate, Gustavo Petro, had the most votes in the 40% range. But a little bit of a surprise, instead of the conservative candidate, it was the independent, right-leaning candidate, Hernandez, who won. Now, I just have to bring this up because I realized we didn't talk about it in episode 10 because we were running out of time and we were tired. But Hernandez, who we didn't think would be one of the main contenders at the time, is 76. And as far as I can tell, he's on the right, but he's Colombia's Bernie Sanders, totally. So he had very little media exposure. He wasn't running for a party. He's independent. But he's been labeled the TikTok king. He did not hold traditional rallies and shunned TV debates, instead communicating with his followers via short messages on TikTok. So that is literally how he pushed his message out. He's the oldest candidate and the one who relied on TikTok.
Right. So, and I mean, that part is cool because I don't think you've seen that in the U.S., like a politician really embrace TikTok and be like their major platform. But this leaves me questions. So, okay, so he's right-wing. Is he appealing to a younger demographic? I mean, what were his percentages with the younger demographic? Because it just traditionally, what I think I know on Colombia too is that, you know, most of the appeal for younger people is on the left. So I'm interested in, one, obviously has a brilliant social media team that kind of...
I mean, this is the thing. Like, this is what's unique. It's not that he used TikTok. It's that he used TikTok exclusively for communication purposes.
Right, which means you're targeting, because unless Colombia is very different from the U.S. in terms of social media usage, this is just targeting a 18 to 25-year-old crowd.
And I remember when I was looking up facts for the episode 10, his entire campaign was run by like low 30s, high 28-year-olds. So he had a very young campaign manager.
Yeah, because it's still a populist message, even though it's on the right. But
I mean, his message was essentially anti-corruption and essentially anti-establishment, even though he's elite, very rich, and probably is corrupt himself.
Right, sure.
But then that doesn't ever really stop perceptions.
Yeah, most of them.
Well, his crime is like Trump was seen, it's against the system and that sort of stuff when he was...
Yeah, but he didn't really appeal to a younger demographic.
That's true.
So that's why I'm... But maybe it's just the same thing where... I mean, I get that Twitter's a little broader base, but it was a message platform. So I'm sure like the mainstream media in Colombia played his videos because they're probably super engaging and controversial. And just like the media here, you'd have to be on Twitter to know what Trump tweeted constantly because it was covered by the mainstream news.
Sure. So one thing I also remember, so in the BBC article, it was talking about at first his videos were just considered funny, because even when we were talking about it not that long ago, he was surprised that he was third, but nobody seriously thought that he would be the runoff candidate. Instead, it was Guitar. I think I wrote it down. What did I write down, Ryan? He was conservative, but relatively centrist.
Federico Gutierrez.
Yeah, so he had all the traditional party stuff, and seriously, Hernandez had like not a significant organization. Let's see. So we took a pause and used the amazing power of Google, and I could not find anything definitive on the age group. I'm just seeing here from America Quarterly that in March, he was one of the most popular candidates among the ages of 18 to 24. I said Bernie Sanders, but there's a lot of Trumpian comparisons. So I'm not 76 and TikTok is what I mean, Bernie Sanders, but other aspects of him are a lot more like Trump.
Well, I mean, Trump's the old dude too. Made his name on Twitter instead of TikTok. So
Twitter has a much older demographic than TikTok does.
That's true, relatively. But there's not a lot of old people on Twitter either. Yeah, I mean, I think it is really shocking. I mean, his background, his only involvement in politics was as mayor of, a relatively small city in Colombia, but really made his way. I mean, again, the Trump comparisons, he made his money investing in real estate in the northern part of the country, mostly low-income housing. But has that very much kind of businessman's approach to politics, anti-corruption, has fuzzy, strange hair. So that's kind of the natural comparisons against Trump. But honestly, has really kind of taken the thing by storm. And, according to the New York Times article following the initial first round of the elections, is now the favor. So the conservative establishment within Colombia has thrown kind of their full backing behind him. So it's expected that the 5 million votes that he got in the first round, combined with Fernandez, was the other? No, Gutierrez. Yeah. With the 6 million he got, and then the 5 million Gutierrez got, would put him in the lead, essentially.
Right. So I was kind of wondering
Petro.
that last night when I brought this up to you. Because you had said all the models you had seen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think everything before this first round showed the likely outcomes, again, based on polling, not on actual voting. Yeah. But it showed Petro winning, even in this runoff, which was anticipated to be tighter, winning by at least 5%, if not like 7%. So it's still a fairly comfortable, statistically significant lead. But now with these two combined vote totals and people really thinking that the 8.5 million that Petro got is the ceiling, seems like the Colombian elites are going to be able to block out the Marxist rebel, and Colombia is not going to see its first left-wing president.
I don't know. It's pretty crazy. I was just looking at a graph I had here from when we were talking about it in late March that I had looked at. And it was just when he had started to kind of emerge in third place. And these were like voter intention polls. Again, this was the end of March, but you had Petro, who was over 30%. You had Gutierrez, who was like at 25%. And Hernandez at that time was only 10%.
Right.
So he's really surged late. And from what I've read, just the popularity of his TikTok just caught on. At first it was just young people and it was like these goofy videos and just...
Yep. And we're going to assume this is all on the up and up. I mean, because the other thing that I anticipated was no way Colombia is going to the elites aren't going to allow a left-wing president to be elected. And they have a very long history of, making sure that the guy does not make it to the finish line through extrajudicial means. So I'm going to assume this is on the up and up. I don't know if their elections are monitored by the UN or an outside third party.
I think they are. I think the elections have always been considered
clean.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't remember any period where they have not.
Yeah, but this is the first time really the elites have been threatened in a meaningful way. So it makes me wonder, but the narrative checks out, the enthusiasm seems to check out. So yeah, this is good. Well, this went from, it was going to be an exciting outcome and an election to follow either way, but now it's really, this will be interesting.
Please do listen, though, to episode 10, where we discuss Petro and the consequences of Colombia turning left along the rest of South America these days. But obviously, this new challenge and this new situation we will discuss in more detail. Runoff election is June 19th. And so we will probably be talking all about it in our next podcast.
Yep.
So shifting to the main topic of the overall episode. So the first place that Biden went to on his trip to Asia was South Korea, where they had a summit, the South Korea-U.S. summit. South Korea, as we also mentioned in episode 10, just elected their president, who is more conservative. And they tightened their cooperation mainly in the terms of expanded military drills and security cooperation. These joint military exercises had actually been stopped by Trump because he said that they were unnecessarily provocative to North Korea. And so it's not that surprising that in the summit, that they decided to restart those exercises and expand them to some extent. But they also, as we'll talk a little bit, they also talked about the Indo-Pacific Agreement, and it was actually South Korea who was one of the forces in watering it down, and that the final agreement said that they were committed to negotiations, but not actually anything other more significant than that, instead of having some sort of substance to it. Because they're not sure what they think of it.
Yeah, I didn't read that. And I think we'll get into it's more the domestic constraints kind of the U.S. side of how it's kind of structured. But I mean, I think overall, the being able to get, because honestly, I don't think people thought they'd be able to attract any nations on board given the TPP. So the fact they were able to sign on 13 countries to a looser framework. But I mean, I think my understanding is South Korea has been pretty enthusiastic about.
I remember because the summit was the very first thing that happened. And I remember that was the first time I heard about this Indo-Pacific Treaty, and that people thought there'd be a more substantive statement, that there would be like some concrete goals instead of just saying, well, we're putting together topics on what these negotiations will be on. And South Korea was a leader in that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think and we'll get into it. I mean, the disappointment's more around the U.S. and its ability to offer incentives for the framework. But the framework itself, I think people were encouraged. I mean, people want the U.S. in the discussion again and as a partner.
Well, we'll discuss it. I'm just discussing in the news outputs from that summit how one of the reasons why there was not a firmer commitment, a firmer the commitment of the countries that signed it was that they would consider negotiations.
Yeah, it's a framework. It's not an economic trade because the U.S. cannot negotiate. It has no political will.
But the U.S. wanted to announce that negotiations would begin at a certain period of time. And that's what South Korea prevented.
Okay. But overall, I mean, I think the election with the new president of South Korea has been a great boon for the United States from a strategic standpoint. I mean, everything that they're pushing for in terms of security arrangements, in terms of strengthening the trilateral relationship between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, their more aggressive stance on supply chains in regards to China.
We'll see.
Yeah, it all has to be backed by action. Their interest in joining the Quad. All of these are enormously beneficial to U.S. strategic interests.
On the security front. And I think, as when we talked about the presidential election there, the increased willingness to cooperate with Japan is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the biggest. I mean, the whole strategy really kind of hinges on.
And that's been perpetually
Japan
a difficulty.
Yes. Right.
Because South Korea and Japan, on both sides, they've had these serious trade disputes. I mean, there's more disputes between them than there are with each other in China. And so sort of a commitment, there's no sense of how Japan will respond to that commitment, but I think it's really positive in getting something done. Yeah. Now, this is also taking in the context of North Korea has definitely increased the pace of its missile launches during the summit. I think with South Korea, it launched 3 missiles, and one of them being an intercontinental ballistic missile. Okay, so what I wanted to say about this is North Korea has me more nervous in a long time because of COVID. because they have no vaccinations at all.
So not even from China?
No, zero.
Okay.
Well, COVID is spreading. That's going to cause a lot of chaos.
I don't think it'll cause the chaos because North Korea's economy is not very advanced. I mean, how many people died from starvation during that massive? Death toll was a percentage way higher than COVID's 1-2% ceiling that COVID likely has.
I don't know that's necessarily
And in terms of
true.
their hospital system, it's too primitive to overwhelm anything. And what industry is that? I mean, I just don't see this being any worse than their starvation crisis. We're being actually less of a crisis than starvation issues.
No, I would say it's the same. And I think I was a little bit nervous then, too. I mean, I'm not saying that there's this huge chance, but I think when you have tons of deaths and the government completely unable, I mean, even the starvation crisis, at least you could protect the military, right? And so the military didn't starve. But with COVID, you can't protect the military.
Yeah, I don't share those concerns. I kind of wonder if the missile launches, one theory I did read was that because China was losing kind of influence over South Korea, that the provocation by North Korea actually helps China in the sense that China is the only one that has any sort of influence on that. So putting that as the main issue and North Korea as the main issue, and that China plays this critical role, forces greater rapprochement from South Korea in order to help. So it's almost like they let the leash a little bit loose on their North Korean pit bull in order to gain that leverage back with South Korea. I mean,
to some extent, I don't think that they were a huge factor in constraining missile launches.
Yeah. I mean, that would be the counter, is that China's never been effective in constraining. That's really why China's lost some influence, is because they've shown that they're unwilling to control their pit bull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, which is, it always goes back and forth. And the previous South Korean leader was really hesitant to join some of the security talk about containing China because it felt like China was important in trying to manage North Korea.
Right.
And so there's also this countersense in South Korea that, well, China isn't really doing anything, so we might as well just put all our eggs in the U.S. basket. To some extent. I mean, China's enormously important to their economy, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And, the trade frictions between the U.S. and South Korea were also just made really prominent by Trump. And I think everybody thinks about this administration in the context of, well, everything could change again.
Yeah, that's definitely the backdrop for everything, for Biden's entire trip. It's around that ability to change with the new administration.
Yeah. So that's the context of that. I just thought that was important to mention. Is there anything else about that portion of the trip?
No, I mean, overall, I think it went well. It was very positive. And like I said, the election of Yoon is a huge strategic advantage to the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. So the news that probably got the most attention was Biden's statement regarding Taiwan when asked, would the U.S. commit to defending Taiwan militarily? He said yes. And the controversy is whether the U.S. policy, strategic ambiguity, which is to not say whether they would intervene with military force. Obviously, we provide a lot of military to support Taiwan as it is in equipment and some training. So a lot of people say that this undercuts that policy. The White House came back saying U.S. policy has not changed. A lot of the media is saying this is a gaffe, a Biden gaffe, but I don't think it's a gaffe at all. I think Biden said what he means. And I think, if anything, if strategic ambiguity still exists, it is that Biden saying that is not necessarily part of official U.S. policy. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I totally agree. It's not a gaffe because he was asked to clarify multiple times. And I think it was clear. But I think it was a direct message to Beijing which Beijing knows already. And in terms of its military buildup and what its strategy, if it were to go after Taiwan, it assumes that the U.S. will intervene militarily, and it has invested in military capability to neutralize U.S. naval assets. So I think it's just it's a clarification and a message and a warning that because of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, that the calculus has changed and that it's worth being more explicit that the U.S. will defend, even though it can't formally say that it's going to defend. So there's still that ambiguity, but everybody knows, both sides know what the real deal is.
Which I thought was good. It just reminded me as you were talking that it was just a couple of weeks ago that I was talking to had the pleasure of talking to him, a pretty prominent scholar on U.S.-China relations. And he was very skeptical that the U.S. would militarily defend Taiwan. And I was like, no, 100%. I'm 100% sure we would have military intervention. He was like, I'm 100% sure we wouldn't. I was like, well, I hope we never find out. But I never had any doubts about it, at least not unless something changes.
Well, did you press him some to see what his thinking on why? Is it just that domestically he doesn't think the American people would support the defense of Taiwan?
This was at our
soldiers dying.
Very end of our conversation as we were trying to get ready to go. Yeah. I did press him on it. And those were that the U.S. is firmly committed to not getting into another war. The domestic populace would not support it, either the economic costs or the military costs. He thought that we would definitely not take any more actions than we have on Ukraine.
Huh, okay.
And that changed my mind zero. I didn't change his mind either, but it's something I feel a lot of certainty about. And I think, coming in the context, which this main trip was all about containing China. Again, a couple of weeks, or during this trip, I was listening to a CNN anchor suggesting that that China's statement was making some statement about the U.S. containing China and how it was like on par with their propaganda for Russia. And I'm like, no, they recognize that all of this is not defensive measure, that we are actively trying to constrain China by having a more significant influence. We are trying to prevent it obtaining any more economic or military or political power.
Right.
We're very clear about that.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't China feel threatened by that?
Well, why are they? Their territory isn't threatened. We're trying to maintain the status quo.
Right.
What we're preventing is their hegemony in Asia, which is their intent and their stated intent from like the Seven Lines policy in the South China Sea.
Right. So
how's that a threat to them? That's the same threat the way that NATO is a threat to Russia. There's no territory. Your territorial integrity isn't being undermined in any way by assuming the status quo.
Yeah, but your power is certainly. Russia didn't really have much of ability to extend its influence, but China does, and China has been trying. And this is specifically designed so that to minimize the influence it already has, and definitely not give it more power. That's threatening. China is expanding economic, and it obviously wants to expand influence. It's one thing to expand military influence, but to have other types of hegemonic power, like economic and stuff, I don't know. I think it's threatening.
Yeah, it's threatening to their national ambitions in that sense, yes.
Right.
Yep,
I'm not saying they're going to respond militarily because it's not about their territory, but it is certainly...
Right, but it's always these autocrats, they frame it that it's a threat because, the way Russia hyperventilates, they're like... if Russia, this is going to be the end of Russia. If Russia doesn't exist, the world shouldn't exist. Where NATO, it's always framed, at least domestically, as a territorial conquering or dismantling of the country.
I don't think China's put it that way.
I don't think China, although obviously there's a history they can draw upon in the 100 years of humiliation where they were legitimately carved up by Western powers. So you could easily...
They bring
that sort of territorial paranoia.
They bring that in, but not in. They are not arguing about territory, but they are arguing they have a right to expand their power based on the same rights that the U.S. did. That's their And here,
Yeah, it's the whole great power.
Yeah.
And then this is the other part of the great power. As long as the U.S. can muster the will and the allies, it's going to push back against that and try to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
So I see this as kind of a affirmation. And I think, Blinken really laid it out this last week on Thursday. This is kind of following Biden's return. But he said, very clear terms, it's China that represents the most potent and determined threat to the American champion world order. Only China, he continued, has both the intent to reshape the international order and the power to do so. And thus, the United States' goal is to rally coalitions of other nations to meet Beijing's challenge. I mean, that is his clear statement of containment. So now before we kind of danced around it, but now it's like, yeah, we are in the game of containment.
Yes. And that we made China essentially our enemy.
Yeah, and I think that is the thin line. That's where you've seen kind of the pushback. There was an op-ed in the New York Times today that, again, it was framed around this. We can't focus on two superpower, throwing Russia as a superpower at the same time. We missing, an opportunity to weaken kind of China's ties to Russia. And then if we frame it the way that Blinken has framed it, which I think you're right, you read between the lines. Yes, it's a policy of containment. You can frame it as a rival, but let's be honest. Do we threaten those areas that we've talked about before where we have to cooperate with China, and it's in our mutual interest to cooperate around economic issues and around like climate?
Why would China, we have declared them essentially an enemy. Why would China cooperate? We are increasingly have no incentive, giving China no incentive.
There's still the huge economic ties between the nations. So there's still an incentive to cooperate for both sides. I mean, it goes back to even if there's this framing around.
Cooperate specifically on what?
Well, one, maybe eventually loosening these tariffs. That's something that's been in the news and something maybe the Biden administration is going to pursue. And then around climate, I think there have been cooperation and still talks around those emission reductions, the places we can cooperate. So I think there's still avenues, but the question is, are we shutting down those avenues completely with this harder line kind of pivot that we've now clearly taken? I mean, I think after these last 2 weeks, it's very clear we're in the business of containing China.
Yeah, yes, I think we're shutting down those avenues.
Okay. Well.
And this is all very upsetting to me because I think that this creates a more dangerous situation. And there are areas where we need cooperation, where I think we increasingly will not see it. I think we will see decreased ties between U.S. and China on every level, not just about politics, but anyone trying to study anything in Russia and China and vice versa. I think that this will have significantly negative consequences that no one tends to think through when they put these policies together.
Yeah, I think the exchange issue is very tragic. I mean, it's something I've studied pretty intensely, like at the PhD doctoral level. I mean, the biggest thing that's affected, obviously, the last couple of years just been COVID and kind of the policy around that, and China being pretty shut off from the rest of the world. I mean, they're fairly isolated in terms of travel, and because it used to be, I mean, China made up a huge amount of tourism and exchange students all around the world, and that's still going on. I mean, I know they're still getting permission, but the numbers are way down across all Western countries. I know tourism, obviously, for Chinese going abroad. So all of those things are concerning in terms of the isolation. Because now essentially now you have two big blocks. I mean, between COVID and sort of those policies of being China isolated, and then obviously all the Western actions against Russia, that population being isolated, and what are kind of the long-term consequences of that, and being able to re-engage them and not turn them from rivals to true enemies.
I mean, you're describing the worst case scenario that China and Russia become isolated into their own bloc. I think that the important thing is that the rest of the world is unlikely to isolate China. And while they may continue to cooperate security-wise, no one wants this sort of economic disengagement.
Yeah, I mean, that is the difference. And I'm just talking about isolation in the sense of cultural exchanges of people. That's what's...
I mean, you're suggesting that COVID policies in China will never change.
I don't know, where they go on so long and then things become so bitter and without kind of those frequent exchanges that at a population, at an individual level, people just don't want to go to the U.S. because they hate the U.S.
No, I think that's about
and vice versa. You know?
Right. But you'll see a lot of travel elsewhere. But yes, the problem is breakdown in the U.S. and China exchanges. Absolutely.
In Europe. I mean, that's where, the majority of Chinese students would travel to Western. So between Canada, the UK, Australia. But again, these are all part
Europe
of the...
Europe sends a more mixed language message to China.
That's been the success, though, of U.S. policy, too, is to bring a harder line against China. And they're more willing to do that because of China's support for Russia.
It's complicated. I mean, Germany has some trade deals. So everyone will focus on, well, it's going with the U.S. and like banning this technology company. But it has other deals that it's doing.
Yeah, and I agree that, ultimately it comes down to economics and that China is deeply embedded. You're not going to disengage from China.
But I think it's horrible. I think there will become increasing resentment against the U.S. among the population. And I think that's horrible. Significant decreases in exchange, again, like on any point, is horrible. Decreased health cooperation will be tragic and could lead to things worse than COVID-19. So yeah, I'm pretty depressed I'm depressed and pessimistic, and I keep trying to look for some silver lining, but no one I've talked to is giving me a silver lining. I really don't find much basis. And so these trips concern me, not in that we don't need to have the security cooperation, but that we are so antagonistic, even in our language, that we are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, obviously we disagree on the need and the direction. I think it's good. It's the only thing that, honestly, American leadership is kind of unified across political lines about. I think that she has crossed a number of aggressive lines, not compared to Russia.
Russia invades a country, and you still see significant portions of the population who aren't all down. The fact that we're more unified on China, maybe, than Russia is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, that's disturbing in the sense that's because we have a significant part of the right that agree with the fascist ideology that aligns with Russia and its current regime. You don't see that probably for racial reasons with China. So that's why there's unity across boundaries. And China represents the far greater threat, as I think Blinken rightly states, to U.S. dominance in the world system.
Yeah, I think sometimes we are our own threat to dominance in the world system.
That's very much true, too. I think both sides have not helped the situation.
We could address this more positively with positive language. I'm not saying that...
I think we could, yeah.
I'm saying, what's the point of having this language? What are we accomplishing with it? Are we accomplishing something good?
I think it sends a very clear message to China. We don't know all the intelligence. We don't that the White House and the security agencies are privy to around China's plans concerning Taiwan. And given the situation in Ukraine and the instability to the global system, I think sending a very clear message and then having your staff draw it back so that you're not actually changing policies is pretty savvy.
I actually don't have a problem with Biden's statement. I have a problem with...
Well, what's the language then? Blinken's language is still measured.
Barely. We're continuing the Trump policy.
Well, around tariffs. But again, those are being talked about, something to ease up on. And that could help the relationship.
Maybe. But we talked about... We'll talk about this in the context. The same problems as with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are the problem there is the administration does not want to give any tariff concession.
Well, yeah, let's get into that. Let's transition to that. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was built, kind of from the wreckage of the TPP. So the TPP notoriously was pulled out. The Trump administration pulled out within the first couple of weeks of taking office. It was the Obama administration spent a lot of political capital kind of negotiating it. And its significance was it was going to be the first major 21st century trade agreement that built in, important labor and environmental standards into a trade agreement. And we had gotten 40% of the world's GDP on board with this agreement.
It was really significant to be able to get those labor protections. There was a lot of difficulty, the U.S. with the unions, and the problem is you never did get a consensus around it. But, people were writing at the time, I can't think of one author's name, but that the most significant aspect of the TPP was security. That we talk about China not playing by a rules-based system, but a large trade bloc would incentivize China to want to be a part of it. But to be a part of it, they would have to agree to the terms of the trade deal. So the Comprehensive Pacific Partnership, but went ahead. But it does not have the same membership that the TPP was going to have. South Korea is not a member. I think Japan's only recently. So it doesn't have the scope. People were surprised it went ahead at all. But, that's why we've talked previously about China's RCEP, which is regional comprehensive, which covers like 60%. And, everyone pointed out that there wasn't a lot of gains in tariff, but they have gained in non-tariff barriers, which are sort of like the red tape, different tariff rules, custom rules, things like that. So it has allowed China to still be the dominant player in the regional economic scene. You say the wreckage of the TPP. This is what kind of I'm just like, there's the wreckage, okay, but this idea that, the U.S. takes leadership in this region without going back to the TPP, which I don't think is realistic. You can't just redo the whole idea of it again. But first, I want to say, before we debate that too much, is that kind of describing more about what it is, that the U.S. has this overall focus, sort of as you were saying, that they would raise labor and environmental standards, that participants can choose from 4 pillars: resilient trade, standards for the digital economy and such, supply chain resilience, early warning systems, climate and infrastructure, and tax policy and anti-corruption measures. No one understands how these tracks work. And what countries will you just sign on to one of them? Will you sign on to more than one? What is that? How would that even work at all?
Yeah, I agree. It is the parts that have resonated most, and the reason they have gotten 13 countries to join, and recently had Fiji sign on this past weekend, is around, these are issues that they are dealing with. I think the ones that resonate most strongly with those nations is more kind of tax policy and anti-corruption, but also what was mentioned in a lot of the articles I read was around digital trade. So it provides a framework to discuss these issues. But even Japan, to your point, acknowledges, this is not going to be the rule setting. The rule setting is going to be the CPTPP. So essentially the remnants of the former TPP as the true trade framework
and most
for
of these
setting
countries
policy.
Want the trade deal. Singapore wants the U.S. just to become, they want the framework maybe to be a stepping stone for the U.S. return. Yeah. But the U.S. while saying this is not a traditional trade deal, the countries that are part of it, what they really want was increased access to U.S. markets. They want a trade deal. Yeah,
which is exactly the weakness of it. And that's where the U.S. is domestically crippled, because even before the TPP failed, Hillary Clinton famously backed out of it in 2016 prior to the election because the support from the American people, I know in polls, the way that it's framed, there's still support for trade, there's still support for free trade, but the way at least it comes up against primary voters and people that are active voters, trade deals are absolutely toxic and they know they cannot get them through Congress. So they're really tied where they essentially they have no carrot to offer for all of these other reforms around labor and environmental standards because they're not willing to open up markets and reduce tariffs to the U.S. market.
And so the big problem is, okay, why would these countries accept disrupting their political economy and constraining it by living up to higher labor and environmental standards without a carrot, without any economic promises, any economic benefits with the United States? Like, why would you do that? I mean, the TTP, it was very tough negotiations on that point. And that's what was supposed to get the support of the labor unions, is that it allowed access, or like made countries have to agree to having labor unions. And certainly that the idea was that the U.S. this trade agreement would not be countries like completing like the U.S. with higher labor standards and environmental standards, that all the countries would have to raise their standards. And there was even an enforcement mechanism, which was kind of historic. So, I mean, I remember when I was teaching international political economy in 2016 during this whole period, and, I was showing my students clips from Trump, clips from Bernie, clips from Hillary Clinton, and the importance, you cannot overstate the importance it would have had to security. If you think that economic leadership is important here, and if you think you want China to make some concessions in a more rules-based order, then that was going to be the agreement. We're not going to replace it. The U.S. has said we're not replacing it, but our goals, there's no sense of how we will accomplish any of our goals here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful in that, it shows, I mean, the U.S. is re-engaged into it. It covers policy areas that aren't covered by any other trade agreement. And the fact that you have significant overlap in membership between this organization and the CPTP that...
But you have overlap with China's.
But China's not a member of the CPTPP.
But you have overlap with its own economic... What I'm saying is you have overlap between that and their
trade
own.
is far less significant. In terms of a rule-setting organization, I agree with Japan that it's the CPTPP that is the one that's going to set it. So if you're influencing those discussions, and maybe it just begins with Japan and South Korea, those standards and policies, that at least is some level of influence around 21st century technology and issues that you begin to shape it. Now, I agree long-term, Congress has to get their shit together, and we have to be able to function again as a body and actually offer these incentives, recognize the benefits of free trade. But in the short term, I think it is a useful way to, because there is that overlap, you're using your allies. Japan's done a real good job keeping it alive, and they are the third biggest economy in the world, so they have a lot of power themselves.
Yeah, well, that's assuming you can use this to come back to that. This seems to me it'll just be a discussion body, right? I mean, what they signed on to wasn't even negotiations. They signed on to considering negotiations, and they have like 6 months to...
Being there and talking is not a bad thing. Because remember, we talked about this at Light with South America and the U.S. just showing up to meetings.
So that they're willing to show up and talk, but they're saying like everyone's acting like this is a significant accomplishment in itself, and it's not.
Everything I read was, none of it said significant. Everyone mentioned the issues that we're talking about. That where's the carrot? How is this how are they going to be incentivized to follow along?
How is there going to be anything significant? I mean, I thought it was really interesting that, Indonesia has pledged their support for it, but this was from Indonesian leader of their Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He was saying, it's difficult to commit to it at this stage because there's a lack of transparency. He's like, how can we make a comment on how we actually support it if we don't understand what it is?
Yeah, and I think that's I mean, they have to frame out exactly what they can accomplish with the limited ability to get things through Congress.
And here's also, the timing problem. So my understanding is these countries who signed on to it have 6 months to consider what track they're going to be in and committing to formal negotiations, right? They've only committed to consider negotiations, not to the actual negotiations themselves. And then that negotiation that's supposed to be accomplished within 12 to 18 months. The U.S. could have a totally different political system.
Yeah, and that's the biggest uncertainty is, and if Trump wins, which would be a disaster for numerous reasons. But yeah, any sort of trade things at NATO are probably dead, as is probably U.S. influence in the world. But what I don't see is if somebody like DeSantis, I think, it's not necessarily represents a big disruption. I don't think another Republican will continue the same policies abroad that Trump engaged in. I think they'll see value
DeSantis?
in this framework.
From Florida?
Yeah. The Trumpian break everything approach wouldn't be shared by another Republican administration. So it's really...
Who's gone further than Trump himself?
On domestic issues. That's
because he's the governor of Florida, and there's not a lot of international...
I think it's unknown, but I don't see him pulling out of...
The people who want isolation.
I don't think that's DeSantis.
The people supporting him. I mean, we don't know what DeSantis thinks on it, because we have no indication of whether he would or not.
Yeah. So I think around the disruption, it was really focused around Trump in terms of a major break in foreign policy.
I mean, I'd have to see the campaign, but it was clear on Trump's campaign that was what would happen.
Oh, yeah.
And
there's no doubt
if it's DeSantis or someone like that, we won't know until the campaign because they haven't had a need to.
But yeah, I totally agree that's a huge issue limiting it. It's just I think they're doing the best that they can with a Congress where this issue is toxic and with the uncertainty around a future regime change.
And it's good that they're doing something. And I guess a lot of what I got was like, well, it's better than nothing, but we're not sure that it's actually of substance. I mean, I guess but I think the problem is we had the framework for leadership. Nothing is going to overtake that. I mean, the huge problem is both sides are, even though the majorities don't necessarily reflect it, it's key parties. So like of the Democrats, they can't have anything on more trade because of the labor unions. And they're scared of losing the labor unions to people like Trump. And because, that's the whole Biden, the old Midwest, several of them.
I mean, I don't think you won't lose
union leadership.
Or you'll lose union, members.
Right, members of the
individual
union. Right.
Sure. Yep.
So I think that's one of the reasons why they won't go anywhere near trade. And without being able to do anything on tariffs or market access, which it does not seem like there's the political maneuverability to do that, we're just, like I said, I think we're our own biggest threat to influence in the world.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. There's a lot of takes and a lot of articles focusing on, the U.S. is bringing this very kind of military, defense-related strategy to the region, kind of in its pivot, and China is focused on the bread and butter. I mean, they're also focused on, they've militarized a lot of island. I mean, they're there to military, but in terms of where they spent the money and are attempting to influence, it's on the economic stage, and that's where the U.S. is truly missing in action. So I think the framework's just encouraging because, hey, we're back in the game, but we are crippled domestically, and we're crippling
back
ourselves.
in the talking game, but not necessarily back.
Hey, that's where it begins. That's where it begins. Being there, being present. Those are important things. The region, those countries welcomed it. That's why they joined. And India also, this is the first time they've joined any of those frameworks because they're not part of. And India's very critical member long term.
Yeah,
and around the strategy,
but there's no sense
China.
That they will economically really participate much.
It's the beginning.
I mean, they want a better trade deal with the U.S. I mean, most of this country signed in because they want better trade deals, and India especially.
Maybe political winds will change in that framework, and the things will change, and this will provide the framework for an eventual bilateral negotiations that result in, at least for some of these nations, better trade deals.
I just hope something comes of it, but it sounds to me like, I mean, okay, you're right. Talking is better than not talking, but it's not that. I mean, it's just barely above nothing. We're not taking any economic leadership. And my problem with this is like we're pretending we're taking economic leadership.
Yeah, I don't disagree that it's
a lot of pretense.
You'd want to see a lot more from it. But we have domestic realities, and this is just where we're at as a country.
I get it. But that means that we will not have economic leadership. We will not have any real strategy to counter China economically.
Well, we'll see. I mean, things can change, attitudes can change, and it's important to build a foundation for a 21st century discussion. And if you can influence certain ways in which it's shaped, again, through the CP, TPP, and the overlapping membership, that's a positive thing in my book. So I think the administration did as good a job as it could, given a lot of constraints.
I mean, I agree with that. And I think it was a positive trip. I'm just think that I can't be excited at all about this without substance to it. I just am not. I just can't find it anywhere in me to think that this is anything but a name.
That's fair.
Well, I believe that wraps it up for this week.
Yep, I think so. It was a good discussion.
Yeah, I hope you guys think so, and we always want to hear from you. This brings us to the end of the episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg.
You can reach us by email. So Anita's at anita@kellogglobalpolitics.com, and myself, Ryan, at kellogglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles that we mentioned in the episode and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider.
Finally, I also want to mention that we have a Facebook page now, and sometimes that's easier to interact with people. So just want to let you know. So just search Kellogg's Global Politics, and you should be able to find us.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.